Hey, what's up you guys? I'm Angst Jack. You can call me Katie. You guys know that already if you've been on my channel. For those of you who are not used to my channel intro, that is not it. I'm usually very upbeat, very positive, very, trying to be outgoing. I'm an introvert, so it's not very easy for us, but I avoid the heavy topics when it comes to YouTube. I might do things that are controversial or things that are a little less publicized, but every once in a while there's something that crosses my path and I can't ignore it. And much like this, I couldn't shake this topic. I couldn't turn my back to it because it is so close to me. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And what I haven't told many people, including in my personal life, is that I was in a very abusive and manipulative, unhealthy relationship for 3.5 years, something like that. I've been pushing away a lot of those memories over the past couple years because I hated it. It wasn't nice, it wasn't pleasant, it was quite awful. It started around when I was 14 in high school and I met this person, and it ended just a few months before I turned 19. So it was, somewhere in there, which is one of probably the worst times to be in such an awful relationship because you're very impressionable, you're very innocent, you're unaware of rights and wrongs, which is another reason for me to share my story. I'm not sharing this to get any kind of love and affection out of it. This isn't to pour me. This is my reality of a situation that does not get enough light. It honestly doesn't. People are told to shut up when they're in abusive relationships. They're told that they're lying, that they're blowing something out of proportion. And I'm here to tell you that that's bullshit. But I took the time last night and I wrote out my story. It's pretty long. It's 4,400 words. So it's going to be a long video. If you would prefer to read my story, I will leave the link to my Tumblr. It's the first post that I've ever made on there. And you can read it there. It's titled Domestic Violence Awareness Month - my story. Big black letters, hard to miss. But I guess let's get into it. This is my story, and it isn't pretty, and it isn't happy, but it is mine. I was 14 when I met him. I was a freshman on the color guard team going to an after-school club before practice with a teammate, my friend of a couple years. He was a senior, and he went to this after-school club twice a week when we met. At the time, he had a girlfriend, and they'd been together for a few years. I didn't really know her. He made a couple of potential passes at me, so I gently reminded him that he had a girlfriend, and that I was uncomfortable, and he stopped. We were friends for the remaining 5 or 6 months of that school year. When he graduated, he joined the United States Marines. During basic, he snuck a couple calls to me, and I remember sitting by my window grasping onto every moment. He said he and his girlfriend weren't speaking at the time. He mentioned some sort of falling apart, but that's all he said about her. He came back as school was starting up, my sophomore year. I saw him show up to a high school football game with his very pregnant girlfriend. I was in the stands with my color guard teammates in the marching band. To this day, I can remember in clear detail the moment when he turned his head as they walked by, and the feeling of my heart sinking just a little. They fell apart within a month. He and I kept in contact the whole time. He said that she'd been using him and tried to tie him down with a baby. Eventually, she would sign over all of her parental rights and run away to Florida. She never kept in contact. It's unclear in my memory when we started seeing each other exactly, but it was after this man had been stationed in Okinawa, Japan. We maintained a pretty consistent texting situation, even with the 16-hour time difference and his ever-changing schedule. He was really great then. Those first 6 months or so, he'd stay in Japan through the rest of my sophomore year, my junior year, and a portion of my senior year. He purchased a ring during my junior year after asking about the ring size on my class ring that I'd just received. I thought it was sweet, even if I wouldn't see him for a while, and he held on to it. But during those roughly 2 years, he began to change. He would sort of punish me for not replying fast enough to a text by ignoring me for a bit. Then he'd ask how it felt to be pushed aside. That eventually turned into freezing me out for days on end. He would often call me a popular B word. He'd gone from being distracted and gaming during Skype calls to completely ignoring what I was saying to him. He wouldn't try to make conversation, but he also wasn't obviously intending to miss what I would say or ask. There were times during my junior year when he began pressuring me about sex. I was just barely 16 when I started my junior year of high school. I wasn't ready for that. I knew I wasn't ready. He came home around May later that year for his sister's graduation. I was about a month from turning 17, and I was still not ready. He told me it could be a year or more before I see him again and that this was the perfect time. I said no. Later, during that same leave, we went on a date and saw The Lucky One in theaters. For those of you wondering, this is in May of 2012. He gave me the ring that he'd held on to while we were watching the movie and said that it was a promise that we'd get married and be together forever, that we were basically engaged. He then tried to engage in some questionable things while we were in the theater, and I wasn't comfortable at all. Needless to say, he pushed my limits, but I stopped him before anything really got too far. It didn't get very far in the grand scheme of things, but at 16, almost 17, and not ready for anything, it was going to be too far no matter what. He went back to Japan. Things went back to the new normal. Him ignoring me, punishing me for not replying fast enough, him pressuring me about sex, expecting me to be there for whatever he needed no matter what. More name-calling. It got increasingly vulgar. I held my ground on the sex thing, which pissed him off. His guilt trips started around Christmas that year. He kept going on about how all of his friends had girlfriends who sent photos. Dirty photos. He pushed on that, and so began the "if you love me, then you'll do this." He was constantly making me prove that I loved him, and if I wouldn't do something, it was like 5 steps back. And I'd be left waiting at my computer for a Skype call or have my texts ignored for the whole weekend. This was normal for most of my senior year. My friends started to notice what he was doing, and they chimed in once or twice about how it wasn't quite right. Remember, I turned 17 the June before my senior year. I was among the 5 youngest in my grade all through school. I didn't know any better. I was innocent and young, and this was the first real relationship that I ever had. So, I listened to my friends. I remembered what my drum major and good friend from band told me. She asked if he was sweet to me. I told her yes as a sophomore. She told me if he ever hurt me, that it wasn't something I should ever stand for. I assumed she meant if he said something that hurt me unintentionally. There was a night when I sat in my room and waited for his call while doing homework. I don't remember the conversation, but I do remember it ending with us being on a break for a month or so. Ultimately, he tried to make it all better with promises to be kinder and patient like he usually blabbed. I got through winter and into spring of my senior year, still dating this guy, who went back to his usual bullshit. He came back home in April of 2013, and I wish I could tell you that I stuck with my gut and I did what I thought was right, but I didn't. About a month and a half before turning 18, I was coerced and manipulated into having sex with this guy. He had me lie to my parents, saying that I was staying at a friend's for her birthday party and a sleepover, which I'd just done in March with a close friend, but it wasn't out of the ordinary, so I went with it. I don't remember how I ended up there after school that day, but I was at his parents' house for a party to celebrate him coming home. I went to bed in their guest room, he went to bed in his room, and obviously it didn't stay that way. Now, I'm not comfortable going further with this portion of my story because it didn't happen by my choosing, yet some people will tell me that coercion isn't rape. So, we'll jump to the next morning. He walked me to where my dad was picking me up, and I can still hear him saying something that will never leave me. Added another virgin to the conquering list. That made me feel shitty and used, and to this day it echoes in my brain. My dad knew instantly that I'd lied. The night before I was questioning myself and made some excuse to get out of it, but then I didn't. I ended up going to a pharmacy and getting a morning after pill because I didn't know what the best option was. My father called the police and reported this guy. At the time, I refused to say anything, and eventually paperwork came saying that the case was basically null due to my being almost 18. I was relieved at the time because I thought I loved him and that he loved me. Today I wish they'd pushed me to speak up back then. Our parents banned us from communicating for a little while. I went to prom, I graduated, I turned 18. Things were sort of normal. He and I picked up right where we left off around when I turned 18. As always, it started out fine, but it got nasty, and nastier, and nastier. On my 18th birthday, I got my nose pierced. A cute captive bead hoop. Something I'd wanted since I was 16 and only mentioned a couple weeks before my birthday. My parents had no issue with it, to my surprise. Probably because my mother had one when she was about my age. I sent this guy a picture during the drive home, the picture showing my new nose ring. I waited a moment and saw his reply come in. "You look like a whore," followed by, "My parents would never accept that. They're going to yell at me because of this." My heart dropped. I loved the piercing. A couple months later, I would get a smaller hoop that fit better, and I never looked back. But in the moment, I was really torn. I told my mom that he simply didn't like it, and she said, "Don't you take it out unless you don't want it anymore. Make that choice on your own." I lit into him. I said it was my choice, that he needed to back off. Once again, he punished me by not talking to me for a while. After that, I began dyeing the tips of my hair teal because I also wanted to do that. He said his parents hated it too. I didn't care. Things continued as usual. In November of 2013, I went to London, Paris, and Rome with some of my family. It was a graduation gift. Prior to going, but after ticket booking, I mentioned it to this guy. He said I wasn't allowed to go. I asked why. He said I was going to end up cheating. I laughed at that, full of myself, and said I'm too loyal for that. He then texted saying that he'd seen photos of me and some guy doing something very sexual that I won't say in this video. I asked for proof. He had none. He said it was clearly my head, shoulders, and hair from behind. At that moment, I went to Europe and I was no longer in love with this guy. I was emotionally disconnected. I stopped carrying around then and I should have ended it, but I didn't. And you'll see why I wish that this is when I ended it by the end of my story. I ignored him during the trip, and I told him not to text me because it would cost some absurd amount each time, and that texting was only for emergencies. I came home on Thanksgiving. We didn't speak much for about 2 weeks, I think. But around Christmas in 2013, he was home for a while before getting sent to Pendleton in California. He came to my house uninvited as we were making Christmas dinner for the family, waiting for them to get there. I looked out a front window and I saw him walking toward my house. I panicked. I didn't feel safe around him and I didn't want him in my home. I got in the shower like I'd planned earlier in the day. My dad knocked on my bathroom door saying that he'd shown up. I told my dad I was showering and that I would be a bit, but I also told him that I didn't want to speak to this guy. I finished my shower, and then I listened upstairs from the hall, and I heard him leave. I got dressed, pretended nothing happened, and then came downstairs. My dad mentioned that he'd brought a gift. It was sitting on a tiny table in our entry area. I didn't look at it or touch it all night. I reluctantly brought it upstairs when I went to bed and set it in front of my closet where it sat for about a day. Then I opened it out of curiosity. He got me the Sims 3 Seasons and Sims 3 Island Paradise. Slipped into the bag was also a necklace, something I'd never wear even if we were on good terms. I felt bad. He'd wasted his money. I texted him a pretty bland thank you note. He said he didn't care if I kept the gifts or not. He could probably tell I was angry and disinterested. They sat and sat and sat some more. I ended up selling them a couple years later and used the money to have a nice day out shopping on my 21st birthday with my mother. I told him he had one more chance. Around Valentine's Day in February 2014, I visited him at Pendleton. I was sort of playing a part. I wasn't emotionally there, but making the motions as if I were. He usually did things to ignore me, like playing card games with his friends, getting sucked into League of Legends, which still reminds me of him, and I admit is half of why I hate the game so much. He went to a game shop and played his card game for over 2 hours. 15 minutes into being there, I asked him if I could go sit in his car and wait. I did. I waited in the car for those 2 hours, asking every so often when he would be out. We were going to go to dinner. This had been a planned 10-minute stop. I was irritated that once again I came second to some damn game. One night he was pressuring me about sex. I wasn't interested. He wouldn't stop, so I got my phone, ID, my shoes on, and I darted out of the hotel room. He spent 5 minutes whining and calling my name. It was late, like 10 at night. I felt like a dick for hiding in the stairwell, so I sat on a bench in the parking lot across from our hotel room and sort of let him find me. He chastised me like a child for running, which, no, I shouldn't have done, and I do regret. It was a dick move. He said something about mountain lions or wolves being on the base and that we should get inside. I told him to fuck off, that I'd rather be out with whatever animals were there, and that I'd come inside when I felt like it. Which was about 4 minutes later because I didn't have a jacket on and it was Feb in California at night. Most of the trip after that was normal. We slept in separate beds, by my demand, for the rest though. Eventually we drove back to Arizona. He had a couple weeks off or something. I sort of ignored him for a couple days, still irritated and not able to get him to listen to me. March was starting, and something didn't seem right to me. It turned out that my period was late. And then something happened. I experienced what everyone and everything told me at the time was a miscarriage. My first thought was that my body betrayed me, followed by knowing that I wasn't ready, and finally wondering how that was possible if we were being safe as I had agreed to. I confronted this guy and I told him what happened. His first reaction? He assumed I cheated, so in the moment I skipped over that and instead just asked if he ever didn't use protection when we were together. There was a pause, and he said very casually, "Well, no. I put it on after a while a few times and I took it off a couple of times." That's not how proper safe sex works. I was furious. I'm still furious. What I didn't know then that I do now is that much like coercion, it's a twisted form of rape called stealthing. If you're curious about either of these, I've made videos under my Taboo Tuesday segment. They're numbers 21 and 22, respectively. I spent a solid week trying to get through that, knowing what he did, how he reacted, what happened. Ultimately, it would take me a fair bit longer. A few days later, we went on a date. Pretty normal, but I wasn't myself yet. Much like I usually did, I tried to play it off like I wasn't as disconnected as I felt. Later that night, we were at his parents' place where he was staying once again. And, you guessed it, he coerced me into something. I sort of emotionally quit and just let him at that point. I wasn't myself. I was broken in several ways and I had stopped caring. We went on one final date, but at the time I didn't realize it would be the final one. We argued about something that escapes me now. I told him that I needed to go home and that I would call someone for a ride. We were sitting in a parking lot. He grabbed my wrist and forearm and he held me there and said that I wasn't going anywhere. Fortunately, he only dropped me off at my house, though several ideas ran through my head about what he might do instead. Later that night, at home alone and dwelling on the events, I snapped. This was it. I needed to get out. I needed him gone, forever. I couldn't handle one more thing. I was done. I childishly used his tactics against him. He ignored me, so I ignored him longer. He called me something, I called him something back. Come mid-April, I was burning with rage. I didn't care anymore. I stopped caring what he wanted or thought. I was done. I called him up. I told him we were over. He made the excuse that he'd kill himself if I left him. I said I didn't care, which I genuinely didn't care, and that's one of the most scary moments to look back on. He tried to suffocate himself. While on the quiet line, I texted his mother that her son was probably going to harm himself. Then I hung up and set my phone aside. For the next year, every few months he would try to reach me. I blocked his cell phone, then his Skype, and his Facebook. My settings were altered somehow on Facebook, and at one point he was no longer blocked. He messaged me saying he would pay me for sexual favors, then demanded that I give him the ring back. I lied saying that I got rid of it. In reality, it was in a box, and I didn't want to see it. I later sold it too for money that I would spend on my 21st birthday. He would contact me a few more times in various ways, saying all he wanted was to ruin my life. At one point, he'd turned it all around and made me out to be the one who hurt, abused, and manipulated him, even going so far as to accuse me of being with him for his money, which would be stupid as he was a low rank with little pay while trying to support his daughter. I spent 2 years working through his damage. Now 3.5 years later, I'm a strong, confident, loud, opinionated woman, and I won't be used and manipulated so easily. I don't feel as if my story is my own. The girl who was hurt then isn't who I am now, and I struggle with that a lot. Accepting that I was once that weak and manipulated is really hard. I fixed myself on my own. No friends, family, or medical professionals. I was all of those for myself. And it took a while before I would even share small fragments from this epic story. My ex was a Marine who said that somehow with his desk job he ended up with PTSD. For years he took it out on a young girl who only wanted to love and be there for someone she thought cared about her too. During the time when I worked on myself, I put on the facade of a stronger, opinionated, stick-to-her-guns type of person. Eventually, that became my reality, only better. I love who I am. Every bad joke, every opinion, every belief, every dream that I want to achieve. I can live with and care for this version of myself, but I don't think I could have been the same had I not gone through that abusive and manipulative relationship. So, here's to the girl with the little voice that helped make me who I am today. I'm sorry nobody saw through the mask, and how nobody cared enough to help you or offer you a moment to talk about what was happening. I'll be better for the both of us now. I promise.